Now, taking a look back at history, today is the 65th anniversary of the bombing of Dresden during World War II. The controversy surrounding the bombing of the city has never died down. It was the cultural center of Germany that had been untouched by war and had been filled with German refugees escaping from the approaching Red Army. A city with no military value, and yet the Allied forces decided to turn it into an incinerator. It's sometimes called the Dresden Holocaust, or explained as the most sordid war crime of all time. And now neo-Nazis have gained permission to demonstrate in the city in the thousands this coming Saturday. So how do we properly look back on this historic and very tragic day? Well, joining me from Ontario, Canada, I have author Jacques Pavlov. Jacques, thank you for joining me. First of all, do you see this as this grave humanitarian disaster? Can you paint the picture for us of really the extent of the disaster after the bombing?
Well, yes, I do. Of course, it was one of the great disasters of the war, in which there were many. One of the problems with the Dresden bombing is that we don't really know how many victims there were. At one point, figures up to 500,000 were mentioned. Today, the consensus, and it's a conservative one, is that between 25,000 and 40,000 people were killed, which is an awful lot of people, of course.
Do you think that this receives the attention that it should have? It seems like this is not one of those stories that you typically hear when we discuss World War II, or at least it's not as mentioned as much as other examples.
No, it's not, because even though it was a pretty terrible bombing raid, one of the worst ones of the war in Germany, of course it was followed by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were even more terrible, and of course which are believed to have ended the war, at least in Japan. So that in comparison to that, Dresden seemed less important. Having said that, though, a lot of people are aware of what happened in Dresden, do feel it was an unusually terrible massacre, needless, senseless, or so they say, and that's why a lot of people are aware of what happened in Dresden and feel very uncomfortable about it, and it's still a very controversial topic indeed.
It is still very controversial, and do you feel like this is one of those examples where history is often written by the victors?
Well, it is. Of course, it's true that history is written by the victors, but then again, in the case of the Second World War, there were a number of victors. The United States and Britain were victors, and they write a history from their perspective, and Hollywood, of course, reiterates that view. Now, the Soviet Union and Russia were also among the victors and had a totally different view of history. And interestingly enough, what I argue, I think it's interesting, is that the bombing of Dresden, the obliteration of an entire German city at the end of the war, when it was really no longer militarily important to wipe out yet another German city, and when really it was only a matter of time, a few weeks or months before the Germans would capitulate, that the bombing of Dresden had more to do actually with inter-Allied relations. It had to do with the British and the Americans wanting to show Moscow what kind of what great air force the Western Allies had. That, to me, was the real reason why Dresden was bombed. Because it was believed that within days after the bombing, the Red Army would occupy Dresden and would be able to see with their own eyes what the British and American bombers could do in one single night to a city. Which is, by the way, why they chose Dresden, previously untouched pretty well by bombing, and then destroyed in one night.
Yes, I have heard that argument, definitely. What does Dresden look like today compared to the devastation that was wreaked upon it 65 years ago?
Well, I've been to Dresden a number of times, and I'm going again next month. It's a wonderful city today, totally rebuilt, very touristy, very pretty. When I went there for the first time in the 1980s, it was still part of the German Democratic Republic. At that stage, for example, you could still see the scars. You can still see them today here and there, I'm not saying that it's totally rebuilt. But for example, one of the biggest churches of Dresden was totally destroyed in the bombing, as were all other buildings pretty well. And the East German government had left one of these churches as a ruin. And of course, that was pretty spectacular. This ruin in the middle of a city, which otherwise the East Germans had started rebuilt, most spectacularly the wonderful Semper Opera. So that ruin was right there as a big reminder of the terrible bombing, But that's been wiped out now. And actually, that's controversial in itself, because some people feel that it was better to leave one church in ruins as a reminder of this terrible event, as opposed to just rebuilding it and thereby sort of sweeping the history, the nasty part of history, under the rug.
If we look at reminders of this bombing, too, what do you make of the events that are expected to happen this weekend, where thousands of neo-Nazis have now been granted permission to demonstrate in the city, and as well the mayor has asked other people to come out and counter them?
Well, I have no use for neo-Nazis, or for that matter, for the old Nazis. I think the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, want to make a point here, namely that the Germans were also victims of the war, and therefore, they sort of deserve sympathy and so on. And that is not something not a viewpoint that I share. So while I guess people should be free to demonstrate, I think their point is not the correct one. It's not right to make as big a deal of Dresden as they do. Rightly so. It does not make Germany suddenly a victim, rather than a culprit in the Second World War.
And do you think that that's really deep-rooted in history, or does that show some other more modern resentment, too, perhaps, towards Britain or towards the U.S.?
Well, today, of course, I mean, history is never totally the past. People sometimes say this is past history. It's redundant, of course. In other words, forget it. You can't easily forget it. The history is still with us today. In the Second World War, it's only 65 years ago. That's not very long in terms of history. And these things still have to be settled. They still have to be sort of digested by everybody, by the winners and the losers, and the people that are watching from the sidelines. And big catastrophic events like the bombing of Dresden and Hiroshima are something that are going to remain very, very controversial for a long time still, undoubtedly.
I want to thank you for joining me. The 65th anniversary today of the bombing of Dresden during World War II, an event that has very much controversy surrounding it, and one that wreaked damage upon a cultural center in Germany and took many victims. And now today, neo-Nazis have now gained permission to demonstrate this weekend in Dresden. All right.